We're continuing our sermon series today with the sermon series, Nevertheless, She Persisted. I've got to tell you, I've really enjoyed this sermon series and looking and reading and studying on some of these stories of the Bible. And today we're focusing on the book of Ruth. I want to say right up front that I think the book of Ruth is one of the most stunning, subversive, and sacred stories of the Old Testament. It's a very short book. I encourage you to read it sometime this week. It's 4 chapters. You can read it in less than 10 minutes. And it is a book that captures your attention. It draws you in. You can identify with the main characters. And by the end, I think it leaves you with the question, what about me? What about us? So I want to just tell you about this book. It starts out with a famine. And so Naomi and her husband, Elimelech, decide to leave the land of Bethlehem, the land that they have always known, and they journey to Moab, where, according to rumors, there was better land and no famine. So Moab was the land of foreigners, and this is big in the ancient world because you always wanted to stay where home was, but they left. They went on a journey. The Moabites had all of the different customs, but Naomi and her husband were determined to settle down and to make a life there. And so they made the journey across. They settled into the community. They found land to farm. They were growing their food. They had 2 sons together, and they were able to grow and produce just enough to survive, but not anything with surplus or with excess. Well, over time, as they settled in the land of Moab, their boys grew up. They married women from Moab. And then, in a short period of time, disaster strikes the family. Naomi's husband dies, and both boys die. And so Naomi is left in a land that is not her own, among people who are not her immediate family, with no husband, no sons, and 2 daughters-in-laws. In the ancient world, in ancient Israel, to be without a husband or without a son was a death sentence. It was a world that was dominated by patriarchy. So Naomi knew that there was no other choice but to return home to Bethlehem. She had to go back and hope that there was something else. And so the 3 of them, Naomi and her 2 daughters-in-laws, Ruth and Orpah, make their way back. After just a bit of traveling, though, Naomi turns to her 2 daughters-in-laws, Ruth and Orpah. And she says to them, "You need to go back to the land where you are from. This is too hard of a journey. We don't know what we're going to find when we get there. You need to go back home." Initially, both of them refused to go back. But Orpah changes her mind and gives Naomi a tearful hug goodbye. But Ruth says to Naomi, "I'm not going to go back." And she says these words. It's from our scripture for today, if Brian can pull them up there. This is what Ruth said to Naomi, her mother-in-law. Ruth said, "Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you." And then there's this line that's often, for some reason, read in weddings, even though it doesn't really have anything to do with a wedding. But Ruth says, "Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There will I be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you." Well, she said these words, and Naomi realized that there was nothing else she could say. And so Naomi says no more. This decision by Ruth to stick with her mother-in-law, to bind her life and likely her death to her mother-in-law, it is so subversive in the ancient world. It is a huge, monumental decision. Ruth is not only leaving behind her faith and her family, her values and her customs and all of Moab, she's also leaving behind any chance of remarrying in Moab and having the male figure that the way this structure is at the time to provide for her. And Ruth puts her fate in the hands of her mother-in-law, a woman. I think this is one of the most daring stories of all of Israel. There are others in Israel in the stories of the Old Testament who do make journeys. I mean, you can think of Abraham or Job or something like this. But they all had a very specific call and reassurance from God. Ruth and Naomi don't have this reassurance. There is no burning bush. There is no voice saying, go here. There is no angel visiting. There is nothing but love and risk. No safety net at all. But Ruth says, I will go with you. So they go back to the land of Bethlehem. And a crowd of women run out to the edge of the city to greet them. Naomi, her friends say, welcome back. It's been so long. We're so thankful that you have returned. But Naomi says this. It's such a sad line. Naomi says, no longer call me Naomi, for I went away full, and I have come back empty. Now call me Mara, which means bitter, because the Lord has dealt with me bitterly. It's a sad return. Naomi has lost all that she had. But within the sad return, what I like about this story so much is that Naomi is genuine and authentic in her faith. She does not pretend like all is well. But at the same time, even though life has fallen apart, she doesn't lose faith in God. And she joins this cloud of witnesses who have gone before her and who have experienced calamity that's been placed in their life with no easy answers to fill the void. And though this story happened thousands of years ago, we know what it's like, some of us even here in this room today, to journey forward with a path or a result that you were not expecting. So they make their way into Bethlehem as the story progresses, and Naomi and Ruth find a way to survive. While working in the fields, picking up the leftover barley that the harvesters left behind, Ruth meets Boaz, a male relative of Naomi. And because Boaz is family to Naomi, there's a sense of obligation. And plans are made, and this part of the story is perhaps not morally or ethically acceptable, and it's another sermon in itself, but Boaz eventually marries Ruth. Now, at this point in the story, you're about 2 chapters in, it may seem as if things have fallen back to the way that they always were. A male figure, the patriarch of the village, starts to take care of Ruth and Naomi. They are married and a male child is born. And so at first glance, it seems as if all of those radical choices that Ruth and Naomi made have only been made in order to revert back to the system of the day. It looks like it's back to normal. But that's not the final word of the story. And the final word of the story of the book of Ruth, and really I think it should be called the book of Ruth and the book of Naomi. The women who greeted them when they first came into Bethlehem reappear. And so they talk with one another. And the women at the end of this story reinterpret the language of a man's world to save a woman's integrity and worth. The men had all gathered together in a meeting and talked among themselves about how Boaz needed to marry Ruth in order to continue the line of the male hierarchy and carry on the tradition of Naomi's first husband. And when they had done this, they had gathered in a circle together in the middle of the city and had conversations, and none of the women were invited to the conversation, even though decisions were made about the stories of their lives. But this time, at the end of the story, the women gather together. And as they talk, they are very clear to say to Naomi that the new child who is born, and to Ruth, that the new child who is born is not born to restore the name and the wealth of the family of Naomi's lost husband and sons. Instead, the women see this, and this is where you can really pick up on it in the Hebrew language. The women see the new child of Ruth's as a restorer of life, they say, and as a sustainer for old age for Naomi. The women tell Naomi that Ruth, her daughter-in-law, must mean more to her than even 7 sons ever could. And they say, Naomi, when you came back to us, you said not to call you Naomi anymore because you were full of emptiness. But now they say, you have become the woman of plenty. And your daughter-in-law, Ruth, has been a mediator, transforming you from death to life. So think about this story, this book of Ruth, and the struggles of life today and the fulfillment of life today. There are times for all of us in this sanctuary, for all of us really in this world, when we are met with moments of despair and calamity. There are times when God might seem distant. But when those times appear, the story of Ruth and Naomi remind us that we can take radical actions that lead to new resources and new beginnings. The story of Ruth and Naomi to strike out on their own was so radical for the time, and yet they said, this is not how our story is going to end. When they arrived in Bethlehem, and then when Boaz married Ruth, and it seemed like as if things were back to normal, Ruth and Naomi said, this is not how our story is going to end. When they welcomed Ruth from a land of refugees, when the refugee may not have been welcomed with open arms, the women of Bethlehem said, this is not how the story is going to end. So why is this book, this story of Ruth and Naomi in the Bible? Here's what I think. I think it's a story, a vision, a representation of the divine presence. Because over and over, when Ruth says to Naomi, or when Naomi says to Ruth that you need to leave me, Ruth always says, no, I am here for you, and I will go with you. I will go with you. And Ruth's unblemished love is a love that flows undeservedly and without reservation. I want to finish by saying this. At almost every wedding and funeral that we have here, and we had one this past week, at almost every funeral, I share these words as part of the pastoral prayer. There is a passage that's taken from the Psalms and from the prophets when God speaks to each one of us. And I think it's one of the most powerful passages in the Old Testament. But it's a promise that comes from God, and it's a promise that says this to each one of you here today. So you could just insert your name. You could say Mitzi or Joan or Jim or whoever it may be. God says this to you. Wherever you go, I go with you, and nothing will ever separate us. So if you find yourself at a point in life where you are unsure how it's all going to unfold, where you're not sure if things are forming the way that you would like, know that you have the power within you through the Spirit of the living God to reinterpret the ending of your story, and to know that you can do this because wherever you go, God goes with you. And this is the good news. Through Christ we say together, amen.